And I'd like to thank the University of Alberta and its alumni organization for hosting this event today. The university has been very kind to me over the years, and of course it had a seminal impact on my life when I was a student there, and I think very fondly of those times. For any of you who want to follow me on Twitter, and feel free to tweet what we're talking about today. I'm at dtapscott, at dtapscott. So let's get into it. This is a shot of downtown Toronto, and we're all living through this pandemic. And the economic costs of COVID-19 are devastating on a scale perhaps never seen before in modern times. And the human costs at this stage are really unfathomable. But in the last couple of days, we passed a grim number of 200,000 deaths in the United States. And I believe that COVID-19, the pandemic, will cause profound changes to our economy, our behavior, our society. And some leaders and governments that failed the challenge will be replaced. Many institutions will be scrutinized and hopefully change for the better. And we're all having to think big, and we're all having to change. And when the dust settles, as it surely will someday, how will and should our economy and our society be different? Thank you for not introducing me, Jennifer, as a futurist, because I'm not. I'm of the view that the future is not something to be predicted, it's something to be achieved. And I want to talk to you today about what I think is to be done. Now, this, of course, is a huge topic, and I'd like to share a few of my observations as a theorist of the digital age. And I'm going to talk to you today about 5 themes, each with a number of epic transformations. But just let's start with a little background about where I'm coming from and thinking about all of this. And I have a very specific lens on the topic. And the lens is that I'm a theorist of the digital age. And I'd like to just explain that. So I wrote a couple of books in the 1980s after I graduated from the University of Alberta. And they were books that nobody read. I think my mother bought most of the copies. But I started writing bestsellers in the early 1990s, Paradigm Shift, that was obviously a big book, and The Digital Economy, which they say was the first bestseller about the web in business. And 20 years later, I was asked to write the 20th anniversary edition of The Digital Economy. And I had to think about what had changed. Now, the book held up very well, and I came to a number of conclusions. Some of them had to do with my worries about a dark side of this technology, which all came to be true, and more about that later. But I also concluded that the digital age was really entering a second era, that we'd been through sort of mainframes, mini computers, the PC, the internet, the web, mobile web, social media, the cloud, big data. And I decided that technology is entering a second age, where we have technology that can do things that it wasn't programmed to do, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that the physical world, billions and trillions of inert objects, was becoming smart and communicating, and soon devices doing transactions, technology in our bodies, and so on. I also came to the conclusion, I surprised myself, that the foundational technology for this second era was in fact the underlying technology of cryptocurrencies or blockchain. Now, it's not the most sonorous word in the world, but to me, this is the second era of the internet. That's important to our story here today, because for For 40 years, we've had an internet of information, but now we're getting an internet of value where things of value, assets like money or security, stocks, bonds, intellectual property, the data in our identities, art, music, vote. Vote is an asset, something of value that belongs to somebody, where assets can be managed, stored, transacted in a peer-to-peer way, and where trust is not achieved by a bank or a stock exchange or a credit card company or a social media company or other intermediary. It's achieved by cryptography, collaboration, and some clever code. So this is an extraordinary time in human history. So that's my angle on all of this. So what are the 5 big transformations? Well, the first one is the shift to digital in many, many ways. Because our movement, our ability to congregate has been curtailed, we're doing a lot of things online like never before. Now, this appears obvious, but it's not, because there are a number of transformations here. We've accelerated by a decade or 2 or more a number of big changes that we should have been making anyway. Now, the first one is the triumph of online education. Learning, schools, universities, and personal has shifted to online. But if we think through this, it will and should never return to the old normal. And I'm going to tell you a story about the University of Alberta. In 1977, I took a graduate course on statistics, and it was all on a computer. A computer terminal attached to the computing center in the Department of Education. And there were no lectures. There is no one size fits all for statistics anyway. Everyone in the class is either bored or else they don't get it. And I worked at my own pace. I remember thinking if someone saw me going over this again, they'd think I was really dumb. But I went over it till I got it right. And I ended up surprising myself and getting an A, and that led to getting a whole scholarship in the area of research methodology that funded my entire graduate work. And I thought at the time, well, online learning will dominate all learning. Within a decade, there will be no lectures. Well, unfortunately, flash forward to a year ago, we still had statistics professors standing in auditory of 500 students and delivering lectures. Now, today, schools and universities are requiring teachers to flip their classrooms overnight from old models of learning to new ones. And there's an opportunity here to change the whole model of learning. Not that we do everything online, but that we separate activities where there's a right and wrong answer. It's called mastery. And we use those using a self-paced interactive tutor. Now, we don't have money to buy tutors for people, so we use technology to do that. That's mastery. And then we free up the students and profs and everybody else to focus on all the other stuff that's face-to-face and is actually probably even more important. The things like projects and small group learning and debating and so on. So there's a big question here. Will all these academic institutions return to the old way, which is an appropriate way of learning for the 15th century, or should they embrace a new hybrid or blended model of pedagogy? It worked for me in 1977, and it's the new model of learning. Let's just embrace this. Now, online shopping, of course, has exploded. And this trend was already happening prior to the pandemic. I remember a year ago, July, here's an article from Bloomberg, New York doubles down on tracking empty storefront problem. I remember walking last summer, a year ago, along Madison Avenue in New York, and like half of the stores were empty. Well, now most of them are empty. And so traditional retail was already in trouble. But now we've got this online environment where a lot of things make sense. Now, here's a company called Majuri. It's a Canadian company, very fast growing company. Full disclosure, my daughter is an executive there, the chief marketing officer. They're on fire right now. Amazon's on fire, and all the things that people said to me way back in the day, no one's ever going to shop for groceries online. Well, that's just happening. We're shopping for food online and all kinds of things. Now, I hope that restaurants will still open up, and I hope that there'll be the little mom and pop stores in our neighborhood. But there was a big trend that happened for a long time where downtown was already devastated of many towns by the big box stores, the Walmarts and Costco's and so on of the world. Well, maybe there's an opportunity for downtown to come back, but I don't know. This is going to be one we'll have to track. So the virtual workplace is another. Working from home really works for those of us in white collar jobs. If we get privacy, you need high-speed connectivity, and if you have space for all the necessary equipment, we're all saving a lot of time commuting, and we're reducing our carbon footprint, which is a good thing. Not just cars, but there should be a permanent change in air travel for business too. I don't think it'll ever return to the 2019 peaks, and the fossil fuel economy is in deep trouble. So this is good news for our planet. It's not good news for the oil patch in the United States and Canada, and will cause considerable short-term job loss. Now, what about the benefits of face-to-face communication? You know, to me, this works pretty well online. Now, I like meeting people face-to-face, and I actually miss being on an airplane and hanging out in a karaoke bar with my client in Korea. But overall, I think that there's a demographic difference here. It's not a question of principle, it's a generational matter, which is that young people, digital natives, the first to grow up digital, as I said in my 1997 book, seem more effective at creating something that I called decades ago the virtual water cooler. And then the virtual workplace is not just that we're saving time traveling around, it enables us to do things we couldn't do before. So telemedicine has been bumped up by a couple of decades probably, and that's a good thing for a lot of people in remote communities. I just ran into a lawyer, a friend of mine last night, a criminal lawyer, and I said, what's going on? He said, we're at work. We have a virtual courtroom, and we've been conducting trials throughout this whole period. The final shift to digital is digital entertainment. The pandemic shut down social hotspots from bars, restaurants, coffee shops, theaters, music venues, sports arenas, and so on. And we're all spending a lot more time on social media, from Instagram to TikTok, which still exists in North America. It's amazing. But people have also taken to gathering online simultaneously, streaming movies and chatting via mobile apps over social media. And if these social spaces survive, will they reopen as they once were? I hope they do reopen, but differently. So you think about something that just happened in Toronto last week, TIFF, Toronto International Film Festival, arguably the most important in the world. And it's tough to replace online what TIFF used to do with the red carpet and seeing all the stars and the parties and the meetings doing deals and so on. But TIFF attempted to reinvent itself, and it did a good job. I mean, I personally watched well over a dozen films. It was probably more than I could in previous years. Now, I watched them from my home. My hope is that TIFF will be able to combine the extraordinary things that they did online here with in this year's festival with the physical activities of TIFF next year. So let's move along then. So the second topic has to do with a whole new perspective on government. So citizens are putting their faith into collective action to address problems. And previous pandemics did this. caused us to think about big things like this. So scholars have long posted that shattering the norms of the Black Death was the first step on the path that led to the Renaissance and the Reformation, because neither government or the church could explain the plague or provide a cure, the theory goes, leading to a crisis in disbelief. So today attitudes are changing, and a big one centers on the whole idea of government. So you all know Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Well, that view has taken a big hit. And I don't think it's a very good time to be a libertarian, because it's become very clear that we do need collective action. And that there is a role for government in society. In the United States, people are looking to the Centers for Disease Control for up-to-date and accurate information and guidance, to the Food and Drug Administration for help with a vaccine, to the Army Corps of Engineers for setting up much-needed hospital facilities, to Congress for financial relief, to the Federal Reserve for lessening the effects of the inevitable recession, and so on. And in Canada, trust levels for people like the BC Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, are very high. This, of course, doesn't mean that citizens trust their elected leaders any more than they did before. And I'll get to that in a minute. But they do see a strong role for government in society. And it turns out that countries with strong social capital have been shown to recover from the virus better than countries with low social capital being relationships that are based on trust. And obviously in the United States, it's a very divided society right now. Social capital is very low overall, and it's a country that's suffering big time. Now, it's not just government, though, that we're turning to. We're seeing a comeback of global institutions. So there are lots of problems in the world, and I don't need to convince any of you. But increasingly, problems are global problems. Now, poverty in New York is different than poverty in Bangladesh, but it's still poverty, and increasingly there are common sources. And the world is too unsafe, it's too unstable, it's too unsustainable, it's too unjust, unequal, and it's too conflicted. And everything seems to be connected to everything else. So this is an animation from NASA about global pollution flows. So you think you can fix pollution in your city. You can't. You can contribute, but we have to fix this as a global problem. Just like climate change is a global problem. And the pandemic has obviously shown us that. So how do we solve global problems? Well, after the Second World War, the winners, 42 countries, got together in 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and they created the Bretton Woods system. They created the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Then a year later, a bigger group created the United Nations and UNESCO and the GATT and the ISO, and we had the establishment of the World Trade Organization, the G8 and the G20, and so on, global institutions based on nation states. And we know now that we do need to cooperate. And these global institutions, we're paying attention to them more so than before. Almost instantly, they appear relevant again. The WHO continues to aggregate data, to coordinate research, communicate guidance at all levels, from public policy to personal hygiene. And also coordinating with the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund and the International Federation of the Red Cross to ensure the protection of children during the pandemic. And so surely there will be a growing comprehension of the need for global institutions to synchronize mass efforts around such problems as public health and climate change. I hope so. But enter the internet. See, it's not just about global institutions, but there's a new way of cooperating together now to solve global problems. Since Bretton Woods, we've seen the rise of the private sector, as a big player in society. We've also seen the rise of the civil society. There were no NGOs really in Bretton Woods because there weren't any in 1944. There are like 50 NGOs in the world. Now they're what, 10% of the American economy. So there's this new thing called multi-stakeholder networks. You know, I've done a lot of research on these things. We call them global solution networks. And they involve civil society, companies, governments, individuals. They're not controlled by states, and they're enabled by all this technology. And right now, there are 10 types of these networks that are actively working away to combat the pandemic, to try and understand it and to fight it. And you pick any global problem and you're going to see up to 10 of these different types of organizations. If you want to know more about that, you can go to www.gsnetworks.org. We did $3.5 million of research, 40 projects on this, a whole new model of problem solving. The final big change in government is the pandemic is revealing with searing clarity some of the big problems that we have, problems with our leaders, but also it's not just about individuals. Yeah, individuals come up. I mean, the countries where there are strong men and demagogues, Brazil, Russia, Iran, even the United States, are failing miserably, India. But the pandemic has also helped reveal a crisis of legitimacy of our democratic institutions. And there's a difference between the two. Seymour Martin Lipset, great sociologist decades ago, explained that, political scientist, that there's a difference, that legitimacy is the idea that you may disagree with who's in power, but at least you think the system is the best one. Well, increasingly today, many people are questioning democracy as a system. And for those of you like me who think that democracy is a good idea, this is a really big problem. I mean, voting has been down. Young people have not been voting. A lot of them agree with the bumper sticker, don't vote, it only encourages them, which is kind of funny, but it isn't really. And then you have the situation in a country like the United States, where say 95% of the population thinks there should be background check for firearms purchases, but Congress can't pass a law because governments are not actually accountable to citizens, they're accountable to the people who put them into power. And this is a big, big problem. So we need to move towards an environment whereby elected representatives are actually accountable to citizens. Now, technology can help us do that. E-voting is a big one, but I don't think most people are going to vote for someone online unless they have cryptographic proof that their vote has not been moved or removed or somehow messed with. And this new technology, blockchain, can enable that. But there are all kinds of other things. I mean, why can't we have smart votes? You can have smart money using blockchain. Send your kid off to university, you give him some money, you hope that he uses the money on books and tuition. Well, if you give him smart money in the future, he goes into the bar and orders a mojito, and the money says, "I'm sorry, Bobby, I don't do mojitos. I only do books and tuition." And then we could perhaps even move to a second era of citizen engagement, where, you know, we've had a first era of democracy where there were democratic institutions, but there was a weak public mandate. Citizens were inert. Could we move to a second era based on a culture of public deliberation, of full transparency, and elected representatives that are accountable to their citizens? Now, this is very timely and important right now, given the upcoming US elections, where you have the president saying that whatever the results are, they're going to be fraudulent, unless, of course, he wins. And technologies like blockchain enable us to embed electoral promises into smart contracts, but also to know for sure that there was integrity in the process. So that's the second one. Now, because of our little technical glitch, I'm going to have to speed it up here. So New perspective on government. The third thing has to do with our health data and our data overall. Now, the spread of the virus and our ineptitude to deal with the consequences sure has a lot to do with data or lack of it. Clinicians, epidemiologists, government authorities have been working in the dark, and there was virtually no testing in the early weeks of the outbreak in most Western countries. We lacked the early warning systems. And today, critical medical records and data are locked up in silos in hospitals or various other healthcare institutions, private companies. How can we avoid such situations in the future? And how can we better predict a pandemic and implement strategies to manage it better? Well, we've been doing a lot of work at this at the Blockchain Research Institute. If you go there, blockchainresearchinstitute.com or .org, you'll find the report on this. But we outline a whole new paradigm in thinking about health records and health data. And here's the idea, that you as a citizen own your health record. And it's a sovereign health record that's capturing all this data. So you go to a hospital, before you leave the hospital, and this exists today, the UHN in Toronto, before you leave the hospital after an x-ray, your radiology report is in your record. Now the next step will be is that you own the record, and you could get a second opinion or send it out to somebody else, or you could anonymize the record and give it to science or whatever. We generate this data, and increasingly it's very detailed data, including real-time stuff coming from your body, wearables, your heart rate, why not your blood pressure, your temperature, or whether or not you're coughing. The data comes from us. And imagine if all this data were captured by us in a self-sovereign health record that we owned. We could solve the trade-off between privacy and public safety. Our digital health records could protect our privacy on the one hand, but critical data could be made available real time to spot trends like the origins of a pandemic and stop it in its tracks. So as part of your health record, there could be state mandated availability of anonymized citizen data about critical information. You could have civilian controlled digital identities to provide pertinent health information that could help with the treatment, but also incentive systems for us to make that private data available to appropriate clinicians, government planners. And, sort of the idea of a safety passport or an immunity passport. It doesn't identify who you are, it just authenticates you. You go into a building and it says you're okay to go into this building. It doesn't say you are Don Tapscott. It's a authorization without identification. And then you could have the data that represents an entire population become available. And once immunized, a health certification is attached to a digital's individual identity. So this is now time to rethink our health data. But here's the rub. This is a subset of a much bigger question, which has to do with data overall and our identities. Think about it, the virtual you, the virtual you, virtual Jennifer, may know, is a mirror image of her, and it may know more about her than she does in all kinds of areas because she can't remember where she was a year ago, or her exact location, or what diagnosis she had, or what medication she took, or what she got on a certain, post-doc, exam, or what transactions she had. This trail of digital crumbs doesn't get captured by her. It gets captured by these feudal landlords. These digital conglomerates, a term we used many years ago, 15 years ago, to describe this, and that's a big problem, because it means that when you think about, first of all, these conglomerates, this data is the new asset class of the digital age. You create it, but they own it. It also means that our privacy is being undermined. But it's much more than that. It's about wealth. And this is leading to a bifurcation of wealth, where a small group of companies capture the asset of the digital age. privacy is a problem. People say to me, well, Don, privacy's dead, get over it. If you have nothing to hide, what's your problem? This is foolishness, because privacy is the foundation of freedom. And all this data represents our identities, and we need to get that back so that we can manage it responsibly. One thing we can do is use that data to help us plan our own lives. And when it comes to a pandemic, well, that data could be aggregated across all of these identities to help us solve some big social problems as well. So now's the time for us to think about a self-sovereign citizen identity as well. Big topic. The fourth topic has to do with rebuilding our systems for production and finance. Now, this pandemic also revealed some very deep problems in our systems for commerce, for innovation, for money, for data, and our technology infrastructure. Just look at something like supply chains. You know, how can it be that we can't get a paper mask to a frontline worker in this day and age? There's something wrong with our supply chains. And we have hoarding. Well, why do we have hoarding? It's got to do a lot with fear and lack of transparency. You know, if you knew that there's lots of toilet paper coming in the supply chain tomorrow, you're not going to buy 3 years of it. So it's time to rethink our supply chains. Now, this is a very important opportunity. And we need to build new supply chains that are transparent, where information can be accessed quickly, where participants can trust the information and about that the information and goods are accurate that we're receiving. And, you know, how about that ventilator? Is it an actual authenticated ventilator? Is it real or is it counterfeit? Do we have enough food to feed a population in crisis? Can we pivot quickly to additive manufacturing, you know, to print ventilators, 3D print them in hospitals? This is now just starting to happen. And it's happening because of the underlying infrastructure of blockchain, once again. This is a $50 trillion industry, blockchains. And you got trains and boats and planes and trucks and all these different suppliers that are working together, and there's information moving around and faxes and emails and phone calls and paper and traditional systems like ERP and EDI. What if all of that were a shared network state? A state machine, a single ledger where everyone had transparency, where you could see what was going on. This is what this technology can do, where you have a single version of the truth, real-time transactions. There'd be no 3-day settlement period for transactions because the payment and the settlement is the same activity. It's just a change in the ledger. So this is a big opportunity. Help us tracking and procuring medical supplies, for knowing the authenticity of various assets, for logistics, transport, and custody, and for additive manufacturing and digital distribution. Veritex is now manufacturing ventilators, 3D printing them in various locations. Now, a second big thing in addition to supply chains has to do with money. And it turns out that cash has a bunch of problems in a pandemic. It's not just, as we always knew, the foundation of organized crime, the foundation of the global drug industry, the foundation of tax evasion, has evaporation and spillage problems. It's also dirty. And money itself has been a huge source of confusion and strain during this crisis. It's a carrier of disease, and the drumbeat to abolish cash altogether is growing louder. But there are other problems as well. How does a central bank or how does a government pay out funds to citizens? The Canadian government spent $1 billion trying to figure out how to pay its own employees, a payroll system, and the whole thing didn't work. Well, there's something very new, and it's called digital currencies. And here I'm not talking about self-organizing currencies like Bitcoin or corporate currencies like Libra. Facebook's Libra wants to implement its system around the world. and if a payment system on Facebook. And if they can get away with that, I mean, they'll become the largest bank in the world by an order of magnitude. There could be good things about it. They could bring 500 million people into the global economy. People are unbanked, but who have a supercomputer in their pocket. There are all kinds of other problems as well. But the one that I'm talking about here is state-based currencies or central bank currencies, the digital dollar. Today, we don't have the digital dollar. Yeah, we got credit cards and computer systems and so on, but that's not actual money. That's not cash that's moving around as a bearer instrument. If you have a $10 bill in your pocket, you're the bearer of that money. And we can move to an environment where it's actual digital cash that's on a network. And there's a lot of discussion about this right now. And the pandemic has stimulated this whole thing in a huge way. Now, China is the one that's moving fastest to make it's called the DCEP. It's the Chinese currency, the RMB, essentially to be a digital currency. And if they do that, they'll roll it out across one belt, one road, linking Hong Kong to Rotterdam. They'll roll it out into Southeast Asia, into Africa, and the Chinese currency becomes the currency of record in the world, replacing the US dollar. So the Federal Reserve is kind of worried about that prospect, and they're trying to think through this. And there's a very erudite man named Christian Carlo who collaborates with us, who is heading up the digital dollar project in the United States and trying to get the US dollar to become a digital dollar. And then we have a Canadian, Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of Canada, and then subsequently the Bank of England, saying, well, no, we should have what Keynes wanted at Bretton Woods, which is a global currency where all these other digital currencies roll up into it. He calls it a synthetic hegemonic global digital currency. And that digital currency may or may not happen, but this is a time where we need to start to really get on top of this. The Bank of Canada should get cracking on this. It's already got some great thinkers like the Deputy Government, Carolyn Wilkins, who's a global leader in this stuff. So we need to rebuild our systems for production and finance. And the final big one, I think we're going to need a new social contract. So let me explain that idea. And it's sort of a little bit of a humbling story, basically. The digital economy, when I wrote that, the subtitle was The Promise and Peril in the Age of Networked Intelligence. And I said, I think this internet's going to be great, but a lot of bad things could go wrong. I said, we could lose our privacy in an irrevocable way. That's happening. I said, this could lead to structural unemployment. I mean, Schumpeter said, the notion of creative destruction, that technology ultimately creates new jobs, and that's always happened. You smash old models and you create new ones. But I wondered if a new wave of technology could come in so fast that it would just wipe out entire industries, and that law would no longer apply. I think that's happening. I mean, the reason that Donald Trump won the Rust Belt industries or countries in the United States, that all that unemployment in those in those states was not a result of Mexicans or Canadians for that matter. It was because of technology. And now you think about AI and blockchain hitting the workforce. This is a big deal. In 48 of 50 states, the number one job type for men is truck driver, and for women, it's cashier. Well, I think those are gone, not in a century, they're gone in a decade from now. And then one of the other things I wondered about is I said, I thought the internet would bring us together, but maybe could do the opposite. There could be a fragmentation of public discourse where we all follow our own point of view. People can make up facts that people would follow. we'd end up in these self-reinforcing echo chambers where the purpose of information is not so much to inform us, but rather it's to give us comfort, check. So all of these things are happening. And you roll a pandemic in on that, and it's exacerbating all of these problems hugely. So, this bifurcation of wealth that's occurring, and this has not happened before in modern history, where we have wealth creation, but declining prosperity. This is pre-pandemic, where the economy is growing, but the middle class is shrinking. And this problem has been accelerated dramatically by the pandemic. Now, I will mention that in the developing world, poverty has been on the decline for a couple of decades. But according to a report from the Gates Foundation, came out last week, all of that has been pretty much wiped out. As the report says, setting the world back 25 years in 25 weeks. And the increasing transparency enabled by the internet has spotlighted other problems. The fragilities of our public health systems, the disappropriate percentage of COVID deaths in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. And the same is true for our financial system. For example, in America, nearly half of Black households are unbanked or underbanked, and Black entrepreneurs are twice as likely to be rejected for credit. And with now the pandemic hits them, and without access to banking services, how can they survive this economic meltdown? Then we have the problem of mass incarceration, a symptom of criminal injustice and racism. And this has only concentrated these risks. And in the last month, citizens around the world, as we all know, and you've been part of this probably, have risen up to demand fair and equal treatment under the law for colored people, or for people of color. And the pandemic has also revealed other deep problems. Judy Mikovaitis is a prominent conspiracy theorist who's been spreading dangerous information about COVID-19. And this fragmentation of public discourse that I worried about has been accelerated by the pandemic. She said it was insanity to close public beaches during the pandemic because there were healing microbes in the water. She warned Americans against getting a flu vaccine, falsely claiming that it would increase the odds of contracting COVID-19 by 36%, she says. She's promoted bleach as a treatment. So all kinds of people with ideas that are not founded on science have been able to find a fresh new voice here. And the pandemic and the fragmentation of public discourse have intersected more strongly. So what are we going to do? Let me close with this idea. I think to meet these challenges, the time's come for business, governments, and others to provide the stewardship and reimagining our social contract. Now, these are the basic expectations between government, its citizens, and other institutions like the private sector and civil society. And we need to rethink our laws, our budgets, putting money behind new thinking. When we evolved from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, we did this over time. We figured that we're going to need a public education system because people need to be literate. So we created a system and we created a law. You have to go to school. We figured out that people would live in the city, so we need a social safety net. We created Social Security. We figured out that you can't have one oil company owning all the oil. We created anti-monopoly legislation. I don't think that we've done any of that for today. So back then, countless non-government organizations arose to solve problems, and it's time to update these agreements, to create some new institutions, some new laws, and renew the expectations and responsibilities that citizens should have about society. We need a new set of rights and principles, laws. We need to transform a number of our institutions and our physical infrastructures as well. Now, this is obviously a big topic, and I've done a lot of work on it, and I'm going to refer you to that work in a second. But to me, and my initial thinking is that there are at least 9 sort of areas where we had this social contract, and where the digital age has broken that down, and the pandemic has just kind of crushed it. That we achieve prosperity through a job. Well, is that going to be true in the future? Where society creates opportunities for all, and that's one of the things the government should do. Well, we have a bifurcation of wealth, where power is not owned by one class only, but we have pluralism in society. Is that the way things are shaping up today? Government of, by, and for the people. Well, the example of the crisis of legitimacy and the fact that there can't be a law passed on background checks in the United States is evidence that doesn't exist. And on it goes. Strong institutions for public good, the free press. That's how we inform ourselves as a society. Well, the free press is collapsing, and you have people, including today, the President of the United States, saying that the free press is fake. It's fake news, especially if they are critical of him. The New York Times, the journal of record, is fake. Now, I tend to disagree with that. I've written for the New York Times. I spent a day doing a fact check on a 900-word article. But how do we inform ourselves as a society in this new world? Where the notion of that we have individual freedoms, we have the right to personal privacy, security, the autonomy of the individual, that's being undermined. And where, as a society, we're going to take steps to protect our ecosystem and protect our biosphere and so on. Well, we're running out of time on that one. And somehow we need to mobilize the planet. We've been mobilized around world wars before, and now we're kind of mobilized around the pandemic. Could we be mobilized around that, where every company and every government at every level and every school and every kid in every schoolyard and every family is working together to reindustrialize the planet? So how are we going to solve these problems? Well, to me, we need a new social contract. And it's a social contract where we need to rethink work. We're going to need a universal basic income, but why not the concept also of a job for all? We should all be able to have a job. And if the private sector can't provide that, we can find other ways through civil society, through philanthropy, through the state and other vehicles. Rather than the redistribution of wealth, maybe we could pre-distribute wealth. Could we do that? Change the way that wealth gets created in the first place by enabling the creators of value today to share fairly in the value that they create. A new halcyon age of entrepreneurship, where we could have everyone being able to participate in the economy through having access to financial services, where we can have people in the developing world having their land protected. 70% of the land titles in the developing world are not enforceable. You have a little farm in Honduras, a dictator comes to power, says, I know you got a piece of paper saying you own your farm, but the government computer says that my friend owns your farm. That happened. Well, we need to solve these problems by moving to a new environment, in this case, blockchain, that can protect land titles. And we can have financial inclusion using this technology. A second era of democracy, as I discussed, where we have a culture of public deliberation, active citizenship, where we can have, rather than traditional hierarchical institutions of government, perhaps more collaborative institutions, where we can have an informed society with new ways of doing that by building um, digital literacy and media literacy courses into every single grade at every year in education, helping kids develop good BS detectors and so on, where we can move to a self-sovereign identity where citizens own their own data, and sustainability through new global, a global mobilization and new kinds of agreements and new kinds of behavior. Is that a pipe dream? Well, you know, Victor Hugo, nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. I think there's nothing so powerful as an idea that has become a necessity. And we need to build a new social contact track. How are we going to do that? Well, this is a new paradigm, and paradigm shifts cause dislocation, conflict, confusion, uncertainty. They're nearly always received badly by coolness or worse. And leaders of old paradigms have great difficulty embracing the new. How are we going to find the leadership for change? Well, let me call today that every country should implement a new social contract and a process to get there. Now in Canada, one process could be a royal commission, not the old school type royal commission, but a 21st century royal commission that would engage citizens from everywhere and engage the various institutions in society. Why don't we launch a royal commission to build a new social contract for the digital age? Surely all of this demands that we do that. So to close, this is one of those turning points in history. The pandemic has caused profound changes to our economy, our behavior, our society. Many institutions are being scrutinized and hopefully changed for the better. And it's leading to some profound changes in our behavior as to how we work, educate ourselves, shop, and entertain digitally like never before. It's caused us to wake up to the role of government in society and the need for global cooperation to solve global problems. And it's also pointed out weaknesses in our basic institutions of democracy that need thinking if we're to restore their legitimacy. It's revealed deep problems in our systems for innovation, commerce, data technology, and infrastructure, and it's highlighted the need to embrace the next generation of the digital age. It's brought deep problems to the fore, such as the current fragmentation of social discourse that's allowed fools to disoriented population and prevent a coherent societal response. And our attitudes are changing too, towards everything from cleanliness and personal safety to our views on inequality, discrimination, systemic racism, and the role of governments and global institutions in society. And it should cause us to rethink the basic contract in society between governments, the private sector, and its citizens as we fully enter the digital age. Can we do this? Well, to me, the future is something to be achieved. And we all have a role in making this happen. This is not your president's opportunity or prime minister's opportunity or whomever. This is your opportunity. Let's build a movement, basically to rethink civilization for sustainability and success for the decades and centuries ahead. Let me close, if I can, I'm a little over here, with an analogy. What kind of world are we trying to build here? Well, recently we've been studying nature to understand what a more distributed world might look like. And bees come in swarms, fish come in schools, starlings over the moors in England come in something called a murmuration. It's a word in the English dictionary. It refers to the murmuring of the wings of the birds. And starlings are out over a 20-mile radius doing their starling thing. And at night they come together and they create one of the most spectacular things in all of nature. And the murmuration has a function, multiple actually. It warms the birds up, but it protects the birds from predators. Looking on the right of the screen here, you can see a hawk, 25 times the size of the starling, being chased away by the collective power of the little birds. And scientists that have studied this say they've never seen an accident. There's leadership, but there's no one leader. And when the moment is right, magic happens. So is this some kind of fanciful analogy, or could we actually learn something about the post-pandemic world? Well, to me, this thing embodies the principles of the new world that we're moving to and that I've been speaking to today. Do you remember I talked about trust being achieved not by a middleman, but by collaboration and clever code? Well, this is a giant collaboration. And there's code in the DNA of the birds that gives it rules. I mean, a big rule is don't bump into anybody else, but another rule is don't get too far away. And trust is really the sine qua non of this new environment. We need to rebuild our social capital, institutions based and relationships based on trust. The murmuration has a great interdependence. I talked about how we're connected to each other in this global world. And business can't succeed in a world that's failing. The pandemic has shown us that. And this murmuration functions as if the interests of an individual bird are connected to the interests of the murmuration as a whole. And I'll end by noting that it has what I would call a great integrity, which is the foundation of trust. I mean, what is trust? I wrote a book about this. It took me 2 months to write this sentence. To me, trust is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity. Trust is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity, that they will do the right thing, that they'll be honest, considerate of your interests, abide by their commitments, and be open. The expression, what are they hiding, shows the relationship between transparency and trust. And for these birds, that's why a little starling will chase a killer 25 times its size, because it knows, it trusts, it knows that the other birds will have its back, that they will do the right thing. Imagine if we connect ourselves on this planet, this next era of the digital age, with some kind of vast network of glass and air and software and cryptography and smart devices. What kind of intractable problems could we solve in society? What kind of what kind of solutions could we develop to ensure that this more decentralized post-COVID world that our children inherit is actually a better one? Well, it's up to each of you. So let's do this, okay? Thanks very much.